Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. My name is David Livingston, and I lead our climate and clean energy work here at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. It's terrific to see such great turnout here today, particularly on a day when I know there's no shortage of interesting TV going on, even on C-SPAN, which is something we can rarely say. It's surely an indicator of the rapidly growing interest in critical minerals, in sustainable mining, in the supply chains and the value chains that stand behind the energy transition which we're going through. Either that, or you're all just big fans of Australia. It could be a little bit of both. I know it's the case for me. And in either case, you are lucky today. But first, I just want to briefly thank the efforts of my team, Zach Strauss, Mitali Merla, our terrific team here at the Atlantic Council, who are instrumental in organizing this event. I'm also deeply grateful to the Embassy of Australia for all of their help in making this possible. As our Global Energy Center expands its work on critical minerals and ensuring a sustainable and secure supply of materials for the energy and defense sectors, we are pleased and honored to welcome Minister Matt Canavan here today. You will hear from him shortly about the productive past few days he has spent here in Washington, meeting with key stakeholders and U.S. government officials, and about some of the pragmatic initiatives to emerge from those conversations. The transition to a cleaner and more modern energy economy is not just an option. It's not just one of many possible futures. But it is indeed an imperative in the face of undeniably urgent climate challenges. But new and advantageous technologies in the energy sector or in the defense sector are not immaculately conceived. They are derived from complex global supply chains, many of which start with the extraction of key elements from the Earth's crust. In this regard, Australia is and will surely continue to be an indispensable player and an important partner for the United States. Transparency, sustainability, and high standards are the keys to the resilience of these critical supply chains, and this is exactly where we hope to focus today's discussion. I can think of few better to guide this discussion than the Global Energy Center's distinguished fellow, Cynthia Quarterman. Cynthia has served across presidential administrations and agencies from 2009 to 2014 in the Obama administration as administrator of the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, and during the Clinton administration as director of the Minerals Management Service. She knows firsthand the important interplay between using natural resources for societal benefit and ensuring that this is done in a sustainable and responsible manner. And so, without further ado, let me welcome Cynthia to the stage to introduce Minister Canavan and begin today's important conversation.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Senator the Honorable Matt Canavan is the Minister of Resources and Northern Australia. He has been the Minister for Resources since October of 2017 and has held the title of Senator for Queensland since 2014. Before becoming a senator himself, he served as the Chief of Staff for Senator Barnaby Joyce, where he spearheaded initiatives to create tax breaks for infrastructure projects. He recommended stricter environmental controls for coal seam gas development projects, and he identified investment opportunities for new dams. He is known to be a very strong supporter for natural resources investment to help create more jobs within Australia. He is also leading Australia's initiative to ensure it is the world leader in exploration, extraction, production, and processing of its vast critical minerals resources. We are very fortunate to have him here with us today as he completes his visit to the United States on a mission to advance that goal for the benefit of not just Australia, but I would also say for the United States as well. As you know, Australia is a vital ally, a partner, and a friend of the United States. We share democratic values, common interests, and cultural affinities. Our economic, academic, and personal ties are vibrant and strong. We are pleased to have a representative of Australia here to speak to us today. Please help me in welcoming Senator the Honorable Matt Canavan for his opening remarks.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Cynthia, and to David and to the Atlantic Council for hosting me here today. It's been an excellent couple of days in DC, a few more days last week and on your West Coast. Always great to be here, and we are great friends, as Cynthia has said. I should say at the outset too, I've been joined by a number of businesses from Australia as well. Some of them are here today in the critical mineral space. We have a very proud and strong business community in the resources industry, and as Cynthia said, we're happy to help. We're happy to help, and I think there's an here to do. I wanted to start though. I was also here, lucky enough to be here on Sunday, and gave me some time to walk around your beautiful city. On a previous visit here, I had 30 minutes at the Air and Space Museum, which didn't quite give me the time to see it all. But I've got a son who loves Apollo 11 and NASA and all this stuff, so I had to go. And I went again on the weekend. I had a couple of hours, so I was able to read some of the exhibits this time, rather than just go to the store and get some NASA memorabilia. And I noticed, I was reading a plaque about the X-15 plane. Those of you who follow these things or have sons who follow these things might know the X-15 is the fastest plane in history. It still holds the record of over Mach 6.7 or so. And I was reading a little plaque, and it said the X-15 has this distinctive black colour. And the plaque said that it got that colour from the use of iron, nickel, and niobium. Andrew, niobium. Niobium. I'm looking at my geologist in the audience. Niobium. And niobium is one of these critical minerals. It's one of the, on your list of 35 critical minerals to the US economy. And it helped you develop the technologies that ultimately led to putting a man on the moon 50 years ago. And who knows, without that mineral, that might not have happened. But it was essential in some of the research that went into that. This mineral, niobium, actually was only first identified in a certain form in 1801, only around 200 years ago. It wasn't properly defined until the 1840s. And I think it wasn't named until after World War II, and used first commercially after that. And so some of these minerals are incredibly new. Most of the geologists I talk to and work with, like Andrew from Geoscience Australia, their timescales tend to be in like millions of years, because things change slowly under the earth. But in this space, geologically, it is a very, very new industry. A lot of the minerals that are on your list have either only recently been identified, or certainly only been recently commercially mined and used in applications. And this gets to my core point. Cynthia said that I'm a strong advocate for the resources industry, and I am. And I might come back to that if I get time. But why I am a strong advocate for the resources industry is because it delivers all these benefits. It's delivered us the affordable energy that we rely on so heavily. It is also delivering us the modern technologies that we rely on and probably couldn't do without now. And so if hopefully all of your phones are on silent during my speech, but if they are, they might vibrate in your pocket if you get a message or a call. That vibration is also from a critical mineral, a rare earth, neodymium, and I'm going to murder this pronunciation too, praseodymium. Got that right? I'm doing better. Those two minerals create that vibration in your pocket, right? And there are about 26 different minerals and metals in a mobile phone. There's 11 minerals and metals in a coal-fired power turbine. Right? So a mobile phone is more metallurgically complex than a coal-fired turbine. And so our modern age, sometimes called our virtual age, is more reliant on real minerals, real mining, than the industrial age. And there's no getting away from that. As someone said to me this week, clean energy solutions start with a shovel in the ground. Without that shovel, you don't get solar panels, you don't get renewable energy, you certainly don't get electric cars. Wind turbines have over 500 kilograms of neodymium in their magnets in each turbine. A Virginia-class submarine has more than 4 tons of rare earths in it. These are absolutely essential commodities to our national security, to our modern life, and to the development of the world. And that's why we're focused on them. They are not necessarily large markets. They are not the kind of markets that are going to replace our large coal and gas and iron ore industries in Australia, but they are so essential to these modern products that's why the Australian government is focusing on them and is seeking to help other countries like the United States secure their supplies of them. To give a little bit of history here and how I ended up here today, a year and a half ago, I'll just go a little bit further back, almost 2 years ago, your president issued a directive for the United States Geological Survey to identify a list of minerals critical to the US economy. And a few months after that, I was here in DC and caught up with Secretary Zinke at the time, my counterpart, and they just released the 35 list. And I was able, I'm not sure if Andrew was on that trip, but someone from James might have been on that trip, someone from Geoscience Australia did me a quick analysis of, well, how many of these 35 could we supply? And at the time we thought we were in a good position to do about 14 of those 35. We now think Australia can do about 28 in total. Some of these aren't mined in Australia right now, but we have reserves of them. And from those discussions I had with Secretary Zinke then, we agreed to work together on a letter of intent between Geoscience Australia and the US Geological Survey. We've had further agreements between our Prime Minister and President to work on this issue. And this morning I caught up with Secretary Ross and an interagency group from your government and our officials on working on a joint action plan to supply or to help secure supplies of these minerals important to the US economy. And I suppose I might then go next to, well, why are we involved? I mean, why is there a need for government officials here to discuss the mining and commercialisation of these minerals? For most other commodities that we rely on, governments don't need to necessarily get their hands dirty, so to speak, in this way. Generally, and we're a big supporter of free and open and transparent markets, work these things out and investment flows to where production can occur at the cheapest and most efficient place. There are some characteristics, though, with these markets that I too think give rise to a level of need for government involvement, at least at the fledgling stage of this development. The first one, and perhaps most important one, characteristic is some of these markets are dominated by only a few suppliers. So for the case of cobalt, which is a very important ingredient into lithium batteries and obviously the expansion of electric cars, cobalt at the moment, about 60% of the supply comes from the Congo and from one company, Glencore, who owns those assets. So that's a very concentrated market and potentially has the characteristics of most markets dominated by single suppliers. In the case of rare earths, depending on the rare earth, and there's about 15 different types of rare earths, China controls around 70 to 90% of the world's supply of those commodities. And so at one level here, we should be doing like what governments should always do, in my view, when faced with domination in markets, and that's trying to help grow and promote competition. It doesn't matter if it's Microsoft or Standard Oil or AT&T, or in this case, powerful and dominant suppliers of very important commodities. We should seek to create competition and diversity and ultimately resilience in markets by encouraging new supply and new opportunities. So that is what we're trying to do. That's one thing we are absolutely trying to do. Another characteristic of these markets is that geologically, they haven't really been researched all that much because of their immaturity or their newness, if you like, they haven't been the focus of a lot of geological efforts in the past. Some of them, as I said, have only been 50 odd years in commercialisation. And so when we have previously surveyed our geological resources, some of these commodities have not been high on the priority list and have either been looked over or not particularly drilled down into further, excuse the pun. So there is an effort here to work together to try and map these resources in a better way across Australia. We are doing that through our geological survey organisation, Geoscience Australia. We've got an initiative at the moment to try and use the latest techniques and seismic testing, aeromagnetic testing to find not just these minerals, but all the types of commodities that are important to the modern economy, copper, etc. And this week we signed a further agreement with the United States Geological Survey to keep working on those types of things. That's another reason we should be involved. And the final reason we should be involved here in these markets is the need to coordinate across the world here and between sectors as well. As I mentioned at the start, there's applications of these minerals in consumer products like mobile phones, right through to military the most complex military hardware, and all in between. And getting a coordination across industry, consumer groups, and governments is a task we need to work at, and we probably need to do a lot more work on that than we have so far. We are a big advocate to make sure that mining practices are as sustainable as they can be and environmentally sensitive. We pride ourselves in having very strong and robust environmental regulations in Australia, as I'm sure you do in your country. But some of the production of these newer minerals is occurring in ways that clearly is not consistent with those objectives. And obviously when they end up in consumer products, say like electric cars, that's a little inconsistent with the broader goals of those products to better the environment over time. And so that's something we need to make sure we have appropriate price signals in the supply chain to encourage uptake of production of these minerals in a way which is consistent with the best practices around the world. And so what are we doing? There are all the reasons we should be involved. And so what are we now doing? Well, as I mentioned, we have very productive discussions with your government this morning. What I'm very focused on doing is doing business. To deliver results here, we have to work with those businesses in the mining sector, in the manufacturing sector, and in the end user sector to deliver results. So that's why I brought a business delegation here to the United States, and many companies here have projects in these areas which are either already in development but can be expanded, or pure greenfields, new opportunities in this space. And so we're trying to find ways that government can help bring that extra supply, that diversity, and ultimately the competition to the markets that we require or have as our objective. And there's lots of different ways we can do this. And before I came here to the US, just before I came here, we announced in Australia that we would open up our export finance organisations, or would direct them to specifically look at opportunities in this space. We certainly think there's a role for concessional finance here. And there's also potentially, we've had discussion with the US government for a role on the other side here is for long-term secure customer uptake and contracts. Because of this issue of dominant markets and potentially distorted price signals currently in the market as a result of that, there is a need to create long-term certainty here in demand, and possibly some help on the investment side as well through government finance to help these projects get across the line and bring that extra competition to the marketplace and deliver open and transparent markets. And so that's what we're focused on doing. We've also announced that we'll set up in Australia a critical minerals facilitation office. It'll start on the 1st of January next year. It'll be tasked with working with those businesses to try and get them through the permitting processes in Australia, potentially link up with finance opportunities, and also continue the research and development efforts that I mentioned on the geological challenges, some of the environmental issues, and processing of these minerals through the supply chain. So we think we have made significant progress here, and there's been significant momentum as well particularly from a national security and defence perspective. I think the work that needs to be done going forward is engaging and involving the broader industrial and consumer elements of the supply chain here that use these minerals. We are starting to have good discussions in Europe, and there's perhaps been a longer experience with Japan on these topics. And so there is a potential here to work together across the world to solve these issues and create better outcomes. Ultimately, I'm a real optimist for us making this work. These markets are new, as I said, they're immature, but we've been here before. Only 20 or 30 years ago, there wasn't much of an LNG industry. But in that space of time, we've developed a massive market for a new product. Australia's been at the forefront of that. We're now the world's largest LNG exporter. You're closely and quickly trying to catch us up. And we've been able to build that markets because we've relied on competition, believed in free trade, and we've created the price signals necessary to attract, in that case, billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of investment to create a whole new industry in the space of a generation. We can do the same here, and we need to, because in my view, the world's going to need lots and lots of different energy types. So yes, it will need the rare earths, the cobalt, the nickel, the lithium that goes into batteries and new technologies, but it will continue to need lots of coal and gas and other energy sources as well if we're to grow and develop. Because we should always focus here on what's the end goal. In my view, the end goal is not the creation of an electric car or a battery or a coal-fired power station or an LNG tanker. The end goal is creating a better environment and better lives for people. Getting carbon emissions down is part of that, but also is making sure that we meet the other United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, including zero hunger, no poverty, economic growth. And to do that, we're going to need a lot more energy. In the last 30 years, we should be I'm optimistic about this too. We should be thankful for what we've achieved in our own life, most of our own lifetimes. In the last 30 years, poverty in our region has gone down from 2/3. So in 30 years ago, 2/3 of people in the Asia Pacific region lived on less than $1.90 US a day. So look around, you see 3 people, 2 of you on average 30 years ago would have lived on less than $1.90 a day US. Today, that figure is 2.3% in the space of a generation. Remarkable outcome. And it has clearly, at least in part, been because of a massive expansion of energy use in our region, fueled by coal, gas primarily, and hopefully in the future other technologies as well. And we're going to continue to need that because there's a hell of a lot of people still in poverty. And I think $1.90 day, more than $1.90 a day is nice, but to get to the same standard of living we all enjoy, you're a fair way off still. So there's a lot left to do. Now, if we do all those things and work together, we will do very well. Cooperation is the best way of doing this. And I'm going to finish with a little anecdote that links our 2 countries in this space together. Back in the 1890s, an American, young American, I think he was only 23 years old, came to Australia, and he came to work in the goldfields in Western Australia. And he was very successful, helped a lot developing those goldfields. Eventually he co-founded a company called the Zinc Corporation, which was set up to exploit the zinc deposits of Broken Hill, which is in western New South Wales, a very famous mining area of Australia. He was very successful in Australia, but eventually returned to the US, where through a few more steps he was ultimately elected president, and that man was Herbert Hoover. And so he helped set up a company called the Zinc Corporation, which eventually merged and is now Rio Tinto today, one of the biggest mining companies in the world and one of our strongest companies in exports to the world. So we have enormous links between our 2 countries in this space. That's been done through the mutual exchange of information, technology, people, and if we continue to work on that basis, we will solve these problems, deliver a better world, and ultimately have better lives for billions of people around our great world. So thank you very much for this opportunity today. Look forward to the conversation, and God bless.
Thank you, Minister, for those great opening remarks. I know you've had a busy week here in the United States, and we are one stop from the end of your your long trek, 31-hour trek back home. You're going to see Senator Murkowski after you leave us, and it just so happens that last week I was at a briefing where she was there speaking, and one of the other speakers mentioned what was happening with the U.S. Geological Survey and their work on mining.
Right.
And Australia was cited as the real innovator in that space. So it's interesting to hear that your relationship started with the conversation you had with Zinke. And I was wondering, how far along are you since you first started?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, as a result of that, we updated an agreement that Geoscience in Australia have with US Geological Survey to focus on critical minerals. Yesterday we signed a sort of another MOU on that basis, and what we are doing together is a number of workshops here to exchange information. I mean, it's nice to hear that we're at the cutting edge. I think we, and I'm what we call a bush geologist. I'm not expert at it, but I've become very interested in it. What we are good at is some of these latest techniques to use to uncover the surface. Mm-hmm. So one of the challenges in geology is that people have largely mapped and looked at the surface. And I like to use a little anecdote that one of the first first major mineral discoveries in Australia was found by a wombat. I don't know if everyone in America knows what a wombat is. It's like I don't know what, you don't think you have an equivalent animal here. It sort of doesn't move around much. It's big and fat, and it likes to dig. So it dug up a few rocks on this property in 1859 in South Australia, and a passing stockman noticed that the rocks looked a little bit strange that it was digging up. They ended up being copper, and so they found those rocks on the surface and drilled from there and made a massive copper find. And pretty much that's how every mineral discovery in Australia has been made since, without the wombats usually. But we've seen something on the surface, drilled from there, and that's you find them. But only about 20% of Australia has that surface mineralisation. The other 80%, you don't see that, and because it's covered, but there's no scientific reason why there's just not as much copper, gold, other products under that. So we're sort of, I think, I would say that blowing our own trumpet, leading the world on that sort of stuff. So we're working very close there. But the US Geological Survey is doing stuff which we don't. Are probably not experts, and particularly looking at minerals associated with different commodities, and that's a real challenge here too. I didn't mention in my speech, but there's a whole, rare earths aren't that particularly rare, and there's a whole lot of rare earths and cobalts and other products sitting in tailings dams around the world because they weren't previously valuable, so no one was processing them, no one was trying to extract them. There are people, and we're funding some research looking at, well, can we go back and look at those tailings dams and find a way to extract that value now that it's commercial?
Mm-hmm. Well, many years ago when I ran the Minerals Management Service, I can tell you we weren't talking about critical minerals or rare earth elements or any of that. We were talking about sand and more, of course, coal and more common minerals. And we often signed MOUs, agreements with other governments. And I want to know, what, from your perspective, would you like to see happen? Yesterday you signed this agreement with Assistant Secretary Fannin and the State Department. And there are many agreements, and sometimes things don't move forward as quickly as we'd like to. What would you see to have happen quickly?
Well, before I go to that agreement, what I want to see happen quickly is we expand the different areas of supply for particularly rare earths, but probably I'd also prioritise cobalt, what I said there, because of the concentration of those markets. So try to do a deal. That's what I like. Do business, right? That's what I want to see. We built our resources industry on the back of attracting investment, often from overseas, and usually partnered with the consuming countries. I think it's a new interesting chapter between our two countries, because typically we haven't been a big exporter of minerals or energy to the US, because you've got a lot of your own minerals and energy. We have attracted investment from the US. Peabody's a large investor. Utah was integral in the development of our coal industry. But the product's usually gone to the Asia Pacific region. Whereas this, we are actually talking to the US as to sell these products to you. And typically when we've done that in the Asia Pacific region, we've also attracted investment from Japan or Korea or China, etc., or India now. So that's what I'd like to see. That business helps build our resources sector and solves these problems around the world. So that's our discussions this morning concentrated on those things, like concentrated on the tic-tacs of individual projects, what they need to get away, and how we might make that happen. So we've agreed to meet again in February next year as a group, and things are going well. Things are progressing well. On the IGRI, the Environmental Governance Resource Initiative, that's a little bit separate, but yeah, it's really important, and I applaud the efforts of the State Department here to promote that around the world in particular. As I say, I think we would pride ourselves being on the frontier of good practices. We can always do better, but we do see a role in helping promote that better practice around the world. And I think as countries grow and develop, they'll be attracted to that.
Do you think there's any opportunity for investment by Australia and the United States?
Absolutely there is. I mean, I won't mention the companies here. So, because I've got the problem with having a big business delegation. So it's like my kids. I've got 5 kids too, but you can't have a favourite, right? They're all my favourites. So I'm not going to single out. But one of the issues that we've got in this space is, well, we've got the rocks, so to speak. We've got the minerals. There's a lot of steps in between the mining practices and then actually their use as alloys or metals into final consumable products, and filling that supply chain. We're going to need probably third-party countries to help us out. So while we're good at mining and good at those practices, there are some proposals here for the separation or further refining of these products to be here in the United States and sort of provide that end-to-end supply chain, including from Australian companies looking to invest in the US to do that.
Well, I know from the US's perspective, it's important to have a diversification of supply. And I'm wondering if you think that perhaps US is not necessarily a reliable investor in Australia. Are there other countries that might also be interested in investing?
Well, I certainly wouldn't characterise the US. I think the US is a prime partner for us. They're our biggest investment partner, the US by far. It's about $1.7 trillion, I think, invested in Australia from US companies across a broad range of industries. As I say, we're often not the end destination for our products, but we attract a lot of capital from here. We are a capital importing nation. We're still growing and developing, so we rely heavily on that, and I'd welcome further in US investment in this space and all spaces. In terms of other countries, though, we have lots of partnerships, and in this area, we have a long-standing investment from Japan into rare earths, which has worked very well. We are talking I was in Japan and Korea recently and discussed these issues as well, and there's continuing interest there. One area that I'd like to develop a bit more partnerships with is Europe. Again, not a traditional destination for commodities from Australia, but lots of manufacturing, lots of potential expansion of electric cars, renewable energy, etc. And so there's a sort of a new market opportunity for Australia, and a pretty natural partner for us to work with as well.
Why don't we bring the audience in a little bit and get a couple of questions from them? Take 2 or 3 questions. Got one back here? Oh, go ahead.
I have the microphone. Minister, thank you so much for speaking with us today. There was a report just released yesterday detailing a mining operation in Madagascar that involved more than 10,000 children, some as young as 4 years old, looking into mica mining, which is used in batteries and consumer electronics. I'm wondering, including sustainability, but also looking past national security, where you look at ethics in the mining realm and how we can move forward on that.
What was your name, sorry?
Joel Serapis, State Department.
Thank you, Joel. Well, look, absolutely, we will try to do our best to do. I'll premise my comments by saying Australia doesn't see its role as being the policeman, I suppose, in this area. We don't have the full power to stamp this sort of stuff out, but we'll do what we can, and that's part of the IGRI agreement we made yesterday. It's also part of the discussions we're having on specifically on critical minerals in our joint action working group, talking about how we can promote sustainable outcomes. It goes to what I was saying in the speech, that we've got to bring in the industrial and consumer industries here, consumer-facing industries, to this conversation. Because as I say, I'm not going to stay here and say, oh well, that's. I mean, I didn't see that report, but it's obviously reprehensible if true. But Australia alone can't do that. The US probably has a little bit more power, but the real power will be the manufacturers of batteries, and then also, without naming the companies that put these into phones and electric cars, etc. They've obviously, I think, got a responsibility to ensure best practice supply chains for their products. Now, I recognise that's challenging for some of these companies because traditionally they haven't operated in a vertically integrated way, or not necessarily understood. That's one of our challenges from an economic perspective. A lot of our businesses have spoken to electric cars companies and what have you, or battery manufacturers, but they're not in mining, so they don't understand mining. They're worried about the risks of mining, and so getting them to invest or vertically integrate is tough. But I think, given the broader goals here of some of these products, there's a responsibility and obligation for those sort of things to be tackled at the government and business level.
Why don't we take 2 questions, that way we can get some variety at the same time? Go ahead.
Hi, Deborah Kagan from the Transatlantic Leadership Network. How do you stop the exploitation of rare mineral mining from turning into another great power competition? How do you ensure that China, whose interest in the Northern Silk Road project in Afghanistan is designed to sort of occupy those markets? How do you prevent that? How do you make decisions involving that and still have free enterprise?
Good question.
And we have a question here as well. Go ahead.
Right now. Alicia Moulton from Our Energy Policy. Thanks so much for being here, Minister. We're hosting a discussion right now on our website about critical minerals, so this ties in really well. My question is more about supply. For the supply that Australia has for specifically cobalt and rare earths, to what extent do you think you'd be able to displace some of the supply that we're getting from China? And also, to what extent does Australia need some of these minerals to fill your own demand?
Question. So you want me to go for that? Well, thank you, Deborah, and they're sort of both similar in a way. Look, I think the best way to do that is to promote open and transparent markets. I'll preface my comments too to both questions by saying the objective here is not for Australia to become the dominant supplier of these minerals. There will no doubt continue to be a very strong supply of these products from China, because China is a great manufacturing country. They do these things very well. They're about half the world's aluminium supply. They're pretty much half of everything, China, and good luck to them. They built a very strong economy on that. We're very supportive of the economic growth of China, and they'll continue to, I think, to play a very important role in the supply chain of these minerals. It goes back to what I was saying, though, is what we want to promote is open, fair, transparent, competitive, diverse markets. I know that the problem we've got here is the conversation, particularly in the media, will often be more around the other issues. But the fundamental issue here is still any market that's dominated by only a few suppliers creates shortcomings for economic growth or for economic activity and ultimately progress and development. So it's no different when all markets are cartelised, and that's huge implications, right, for the world economy. Now that these markets aren't as large or macroeconomically significant as oil, but they are still so essential to so many very important products that they have a level of importance here where we should seek to encourage competition and diversity. And Alicia, that's sort of, I suppose I've kind of got to answer that question where I suppose I'll take a step back. At this stage, these markets are not very large. So I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, because I've been reading lots of stuff on different commodities, but I think rare earths about 130,000 tonnes a year. That's what I'm looking. Sorry, Andrew, you've been singled out a few times today, but you're the expert. So about 130,000 tonnes. I mean, that we export 400 million tonnes of coal a year, nearly 1 billion tonnes of iron ore a year. These are very small markets. So yeah, sure, we and the other things, rare earths aren't that rare, right? They're everywhere. So, I mean, we could supply all of it, but I don't think we will. That's not the objective, and we'll have strong opportunities in some spaces, but there'll still be very strong competition from the existing suppliers of these products.
From the U.S.'s perspective, we would like, obviously, to have other markets open to us. To what extent do you think Australia could displace some of the reliance on China for these products? And are you looking further down the value supply chain at not just producing minerals, but also processing, production, and
absolutely,
that
we'll
kind
take the final. Absolutely, we're looking at that because the objective is to be able to supply these end-to-end products. So you have to look at the whole supply chain. And as I say, look, there'll still be a diversity range of suppliers. Australia's not going to be able to be even the dominant supplier necessarily anytime soon of these minerals, but we can play an important role.
Very good. Take these two here.
Hi, excuse me. Hi, I'm Tom Crawford with the U.S. Geological Survey. And so the question was asked earlier about Australian investment in minerals in the U.S. And I just returned from the Alaska Miners Association meeting 2 weeks ago in Anchorage. And it was interesting, I think worth noting that a lot of the discussions around there were centered around the degree to which the Australian investment community has entered into minerals exploration in Alaska. There were the comments that Australians are taking over, but
sounds good to me.
But frankly, I don't think that wasn't in a negative sense. Okay. It was in a very much a positive one. That said, most of the attention is still being paid to gold and those precious mineral commodities, and that's of course one of the problems with so many of these critical minerals is that they are byproducts.
Isn't lithium gold now?
Well, the problem you've got, and that's a very perceptive comment from Tom. I mean, gold is hot right now, obviously given the price. Exploration in the commercial mining industry will obviously go where the profit margins are, and partly because of the distortion of these markets, also because they are small and prone to boom bust cycles. Those price signals aren't necessarily very strong there in some of these industries right now. So take lithium. Lithium has displayed the usual boom-bust sort of cycle here over a very short time frame. Only 12 or 18 months ago, we were attracting a lot of investment into lithium in Australia. We're the world's largest lithium supplier. We've trebled production in 8 years, and prices were very good. I think they're up about 3 times over the space that 8 years. In the last year, you've had massive falls in the price. You've had projects be mothballed and delayed. That's the cycle. These things happen. Right. And likewise in the rare earth space, the price is very low and subdued, partly because potentially oversupply from a dominant supplier. So, finding the right incentives here to encourage growth in these commodities goes back to what I was saying about why there's a need for some role for government to help make these markets more mature and resilient.
There was another question here.
Hi, my name is Angel with Hong Kong Phoenix Television, and my question is, what is the different angles that Australia is taking between the collaborations of Australia and China and Australia and the United States? So, what are the different focus in these two important bilateral relationships? Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Angela. As I said, we've got a very strong relationship with China, particularly on trade of key commodities. The big difference on some of these is China is a large producer of these commodities already, so obviously there's not the consumer demand there like there is here in the US and some other countries. Notwithstanding our strong exports of other commodities, it's unlikely that we'll be a large supplier of some of these commodities we're talking about today to China, given you're already more than self-sufficient. You're a large exporter, or China's a large exporter. But overall, on the broader issues I've mentioned about cooperation on the development of natural resources, China's an incredibly important partner for us. Only a couple of years ago, Yancoal, a Chinese coal company, made I think one of the biggest, certainly one of, maybe it was the biggest coal acquisition in history where they bought a lot of mines from Rio Tinto, and that's been welcome. They're a great company in our coal industry, doing very good work. They've made a lot of money. They've made, I think, their money back in just over 2 years from that transaction. So, you know, that it's a really important part of this relationship we have, and I also view this as very important for our diplomatic effort in Australia. We often develop our relationships through these investments and trading relationships on resources. So we have very strong relationships with Japan, Korea, and now China, thanks to the investments. One thing to do business with each other. You know, I say that's like going on a date to do trade. You know, getting married is having co-investments in each other's countries, and that's what we're doing. We're increasingly trying to do that with India as well too. We've attracted a large investment in a coal mine in Australia, the Adani mine, which is under construction now. It's our first major investment from India, and we'd like to build on that too and establish a better relationship there as well.
Do you expect to see investments from China downstream in the rare earths? And
there already is. Yeah, that is. There already is, and obviously, given their expertise and involvement already, there'll probably still continue to be investments there.
Now, you mentioned earlier the new investment office that was opened within Australia. Yep. Within the government. How much funding do you see that putting into the market, and where would it be targeted to go?
So the office itself obviously is a little bit more administrative and focusing on a few key R&D efforts. So it's got a budget of $12 million, but the export facility we've opened up has a total budget of $4.4 billion. You know, that's to fund a lot of other different things, but it's got significant. It's got sufficient capital to fund some of these projects if they meet the mark. They've got to go through a proper process, and while we're directing Export Finance Australia to look at these things, you know, the devil's in the detail, and we're not there yet. Those things have got to be completed properly.
Do you have any private investments or banks coming in to invest in these projects as well?
Well, I mean, that's probably more a question for the businesses involved, but just coming back to what I was saying, you know, the difficulty has been making these bankable in markets that are very thin, immature, and distorted price signals. So it's pretty hard for a bank to evaluate risk, or not just a bank, but equity investors as well, from my understanding. Obviously, the businesses themselves are on the front line of that, trying to get these deals done, but that has been a challenge given those characteristics.
Back to the audience. We have some more questions.
Thanks very much. Just to continue on the theme of finance, because I think that's an underappreciated aspect of this, is that these are actually sometimes very difficult projects because of the nature of the markets to finance. Do you also do you have any engagement as well, or any concerns as well about as some corners of capital markets are going more towards engaging with sustainable finance, increasing the issuance and experimentation with things like green bonds, and now you have discussion over things like transition bonds that sit somewhere between, you know, financing traditional projects and green bonds, perhaps, you know, financing the sort of projects that allow an oil and gas company to, you know, to do more in the clean energy space, for example. You know, where does critical minerals as a sector fit into that? And have you had any discussions with some of these standards makers, some of the taxonomies that are going on in the EU or as elsewhere, about where you might fit in that inchoate space?
Well, no, I haven't, but David's an interesting suggestion to approach it in that way. I mean, I would make a general comment that a lack of capital is not one of the world's major ills at the moment. There's you know, the world's awash with capital, at least in any historical sense. Interest rates are very low, and that's the case also. I mean, I don't see it as being a significant issue for the coal and gas sectors at the moment. Yes, there is a lot of talk about it, but projects still get financed because the underlying demand and commodity, you know, and needs is there. The key thing, I mean, finance always attracts a lot of attention, but it actually is always secondary to the underlying economics of a project. If the economics of a project stack up, usually you get financed, particularly in a world that's not particularly capital constrained. And so with these projects in the critical mineral space, it's not the extent of finance that's the problem. It is the underlying economics that we've got to solve because of the lack of long-term consistent demand and the potential for strategic or dynamic behaviours to affect any project once it gets up and running. So tackling that issue with long-term contracts and support is really important. Now, one way we can kind of do that at the government level is providing patient capital through the government finance arms we've got, because while the world's awash with capital, it's not necessarily awash with long tenure, with long maturities capital. And any major mining project is always going to have, a fairly significant payback period, at least in a base case scenario. So it needs capital that can withstand the cycle or cycles, which is a challenge. That's a challenge in this space in particular and broadly around the world. So that's where the government finance can play a role. I mentioned the relationship we have with Japan already in this space. That's played a key role in maintaining that industry because the Japanese capital has been government backed and has been patient. It's been willing to take losses for a number of years, and then it's doing all right now. So that's the template for us.
Given how quickly technology changes, I mean, you talked about lithium and how the prices varied. Is there a great deal of risk in the government stepping in and financing some of these projects? And
well, we go into that with open eyes. And when we announced the funding the other week, we're very upfront that this is it's. I mean, by definition, if it wasn't risky, well, the private sector would do it. They would tackle it, but the risk is worth it because of the criticality of these minerals to the modern economy, to defence applications, etc. So it's something we're willing to bear.
How much need is there within Australia for these products for its own needs?
I didn't get to that question, Summer. Maybe it was you.
Oh,
sorry, Cynthia. I missed one.
Okay.
Look, not large. Given we are a market of only 25 million people, we have a very, in my view, successful manufacturing industry in some areas like food and metals manufacturing, but we're not a large manufacturer of electric cars or batteries or end consumer products. So there's not sufficient demand in Australia to underwrite the development of these projects. That's why we've got to cooperate and partner with countries like the US to get them to stack up.
Did you have another question you wanted to address?
Oh, sorry, that was the one I forgot.
Okay.
I forgot. Someone did. I think it was you, Cynthia, did ask that question. And I forgot to tackle it. Sorry.
And other questions from the audience? You wanted to talk about coal a little bit. You want to tell us?
I always love to talk about coal. So, and everyone's got an opinion on coal, but we're the world's largest coal exporter. Although, because we've got that tag, people, especially in Australia, don't always understand. Australia's only 5% of the world's coal market. Most coal is mined close to where it's used, just for efficiency reasons. But a lot of that coal is not particularly high quality, and so I do think it would be a great contribution to this broader debate, because I say everyone's got an opinion on coal. If there was a broader understanding of that coals ain't coals, and there are different types of coals, and some coals are better than others, and so our coal. And sorry to use the metric system, that's the one I'm familiar with, but our coal is typically around 6,000 kilocalories per kilogram. So just a measure of the energy content per tonne or per kilogram. In say India, the average energy content is around 3,500 kilocalories per kilogram. So if Australian coal can displace the use of Indian coal, you get, and it is quite linear, you get roughly a 40% odd benefit in terms of lower emissions, lower carbon emissions, because you create the same amount of power for less coal, with less coal. So that, I always, there's in this area, there's a lot of broad sweeping statements. So, well, let's go to 100% renewable in 5 years or 10 years. Anyone who spends any time in the Asia Pacific region knows that's not going to happen. Like, there's so much growth in energy demands that is unrealistic. It is realistic, though, to use high quality coals in more modern coal-fired power stations and make a significant difference to carbon emissions over a relatively short space of time. That is achievable, and so I think there's a very bright future for the Australian coal industry because our coal's of higher quality, and there will be that demand. The other point I'd make here too that gets lost, and it goes back to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, is yes, reducing carbon emissions is a major priority for the world, and a tough one and a challenging one to tackle. But it's not the only environmental issue around. And those who have travelled in the Asia-Pacific region would know well that perhaps a more pressing immediate issue is air quality in these countries. Kills thousands of people a year, affects quality of life because often you can't see the blue sky at different times of the year in Delhi or Beijing, etc. And so, that's a big environmental challenge. Now, paradoxically, the use of Australian coal in modern coal-fired power stations and gas, American gas, is a big way to clean up those local environments because you electrify the system. India still relies on bioenergy for more than 20% of its energy needs, and that's straw, wood, sometimes worse things, right? And it's getting burnt in unflued domestic or small business stoves that just all the organic matter and particulates, NOx and SOx, goes into the atmosphere and creates that smog. If you build a modern coal-fired power station with modern scrubbers, with high-quality coals, you do not get that smog and particulate matter being generated. You can go to Japan and see that. Japan can see that. You can see the blue sky in Japan. They use a lot of coal, a lot of gas, but they have the economic wealth to use modern power production techniques. So that electrification of, when we talk about electrification of transport here, I mean, a lot of these developing countries, they haven't electrified residential homes. They haven't electrified many industrial applications, which still use boilers on site. That's if we can do that, that'll clean up a lot of these local environments, and high quality coal and gas is a big part of doing that.
So I understand Australia has cleaner burning coal. Are you also working on technologies to help further clean coal contributions?
Yeah, so there's I think it's the world's largest carbon sequestration project is in Australia. It's and by an American company, Chevron. Chevron have a CCS site for one of its large LNG projects, the Gorgon project in Australia, a very, very big investment. And over the last year, that's just started working, and it's working well. So this technology can certainly work. It's always going to come back to the commerciality and cost of it. If you can find some byproduct of it through enhanced oil recovery, that can kind of get you part of the way. We've got schemes in Australia to offset the cost of carbon emissions through an auction system. So it's like people make proposals, got the lowest price. So that can provide potentially in the future an income stream. But there's still a challenge here technologically of getting those costs down. I think one area of potential focus is on hydrogen, which certainly is an energy solution. We're doing a project with Japan at the moment with Kawasaki, who are doing that very process in Victoria, in Australia, and that's also partnered with the development of a CCS site there. So there is a bit going on there, but it still requires a price signal on carbon abatement, which often isn't always there.
Do you see any trajectory in which critical minerals and the clean energy technology that they support can displace some of the coal production and coal usage?
Well, they're very different commodities, I suppose. I mean, critical minerals is not itself, I don't think any of the 35 minerals on your list are energy related. I mean, it shows what a major change has been made in America in the last decade. You know, if you asked a decade ago what's the mineral or energy resource most critical to the US economy, it probably would have been oil, right? And maybe gas next. Now you're a net exporter. So the critical minerals themselves aren't energy related, but they go into technologies that then potentially produce energy. So, I mean, look, there will almost certainly be an increase in the use of renewable energy, electric cars, these commodities that use critical minerals. However, when you look at the World Energy Outlook report last week, there's still growth on their base case scenario. There's still growth in fossil fuels as well, right out to 2040, because the whole pie is getting so much bigger, right? And we just got to be. I mean, I remember there was a controversy about 20 years ago. There was an Australian economist, I think it was Warwick McKibben. There was a controversy that the projections of the IPCC were unrealistic because economic growth was too strong in the models. You know, it was because they used economic models of convergence, so saying that poorer countries will catch up with rich countries, and the controversy was no, that economic growth can't happen. It will be too high, and so you won't get the carbon emission growth that was being projected at the time. They were massively wrong, or the economists, and I'm an economist background, so they're always wrong. They were massively wrong. Economic growth was much higher than was projected. Convergence worked much faster, but largely because of China. So you've still got, I think, in the World Energy Outlook, this people, I think, sometimes are discounting the upside or downside, whichever way you're looking at. The energy demands of the world could be a lot higher than they're projecting if India continues to grow very strongly. If Africa develops and grows, there's still 1 billion people without access to electricity. So we just got to be realistic about how much energy we need to do that and solve this task. And we've got to balance that with the other environmental objectives we've got.
I understand you were out in the Permian Basin.
Yeah.
Talking about making news at home about gas shale.
Yeah. Well, I it is. I just mentioned that it's remarkable here what you've done in this country. It is a demonstration of American ingenuity, amazing economy. To turn it around in the space of less than a couple of decades from being the world's largest net importer of energy to being a net energy exporter is amazing, and it is technological progress. And it frustrates me this has been hijacked. This remarkable development has been hijacked again by people who either willfully or misleadingly misrepresent what's happened. I mean, fracking is not what's caused the shale gas reservoir revolution. Fracking has been used in the gas industry for decades, and the oil industry, been used in Australia for decades. What has revolutionised your system here is horizontal drilling, right? And so out there, I went out to a frack site in the Permian Basin just outside Midland, and they're drilling lateral underground wells extending 3 kilometres, right? Oh, sorry, I'll use the imperial 10,000 feet, right? 10,000 feet under the ground horizontally, and this has all been developed in the last 20 years or so. It's unbelievable, right? And I got such great respect for the men and women in the industry who do this stuff, like the people, the scientists and innovators and entrepreneurs who just persist, sometimes at the ridicule of people within the industry. A lot of people thought this couldn't happen and couldn't be done. And then the guys, and mostly guys on the frack team out there just doing this stuff. It's remarkable stuff, and it's revolutionised the world. And so I you look at that and think, well, look what you've done here. You've got cheap energy prices. You've got manufacturing renaissance in this country. You've got good high-paying jobs coming back for sometimes areas of the country that have struggled in the past. I look at that and it's like Meg Ryan. I'll have what she's having, right? I want that. I want that in Australia. I want our manufacturing industry to be strong again. I want to have cheaper energy prices for people who can't afford their power bills, and obviously shale gas can do that. Now, the constraining factor here is the geology. God's not changing that, so that we don't know yet whether we can translate it to Australia. We're still very much in an exploration phase, but we should be trying to bring the shale gas revolution to Australia. We've got our first major shale gas play underway at the moment in the Northern Territory. A well was drilled just a few weeks ago, and one will be fracked apparently in the next couple of months. But it's still at early days about whether it's commercial or will provide the same costs of production as you've been able to get here. But if we can, well, that'll potentially revolutionise the Northern Territory, provide a manufacturing industry to that part of Australia and help grow and develop it. So I'd love that to happen here. And I'd say, look, I mean, I watched Gasland, what was that now, 8 or 9 years ago or so. And when I saw that tap getting put on fire, I thought, oh man, this is not very good. But you got to say, most of the fear campaign on this stuff has not been proven true. It's works. We have fracking in Australia in the coal seam gas industry. it has been properly managed. You've got to give it to them, and so we've just got to properly regulate it and do what we've done in the past, and develop our resources in a sensible way.
Well, we've covered the whole continent. I think we've talked about all
just
the
not
different...
Middle East peace, we haven't solved that yet.
No,
so
not yet.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions here? We're in our last 5 minutes. If anybody has...
Well, actually, the oil and gas probably will help there too.
We have a question here. 1 second.
Hi, Minister. Thank you for being here. How, kind of going back to the critical minerals, how do you explain to environmental groups or people who just see, critical mineral mining as being synonymous with coal mining and see it as a negative environmental thing? How do you kind of explain to them that this is important to renewable energy sources, it's important to the technology boom? How do you get that across and at least limit opposition, if not increase support?
Yeah. Sorry, what was your name?
Oh, sorry. I'm Ellie Potter with S&P Global.
Hey, Ellie. Look, I'm not going to be able to do it all, on our own. Or governments aren't always the best at doing this, but the facts are there, and probably the best thing to do is to start with the facts. I don't think many people realise about how much rare earths minerals are in their phones, or in wind turbines and solar panels, etc. But the facts, we've got to get the facts out there to people. It is one of the reasons we've got a big priority on this. I mean, the primary reason is the issues I've discussed about security, diversity of supply, etc. But the secondary is here also that this is promoting this industry is a way of reminding people how important the mining sector is to the world. And there has been, I think, a little bit of increase in ignorance of that, tied up with the idea that we're moving on, we're evolving into a different kind of world, which is virtual rather than real. But to get into the cloud, you've got to have one of those things in front of you. You don't just magically pop up into it, right? So re-promoting this is important to us. We're having, and I just came from a meeting with your National Mining Association, which are apparently experiencing the same problems, that we've had a drop-off in young people going to mining schools and what have you. And when you drill down, where we've done some research into why people are not going as much to choose mining engineering, it's primarily because they see that, well, we don't know if there'll be a mining industry around in 10 or 20 years' time. So the idea is that, well, it won't be here. Like, that's ridiculous and absurd. And even putting aside the questions on the future role of coal and gas, as we've spoken about, there's still going to be a mining industry. It might be doing different things, but it will still be there. It'll be even more important in my view. So having this conversation here and doing these things, I think it will help remind people of that. I mean, just to finish on this anecdote, we had an international mining conference in Australia a few weeks ago in Melbourne, and there was a lot of protesters there, obviously largely on the climate change issues, although most of them are just quasi-communists. But they're jumping on this bandwagon, campaigning against climate change, and they were accosting a few people. And one of the first people they sort of pushed around and spat on apparently was actually a lithium miner, right? And they're using phones and promoting renewable energy and then having a go at a guy who's critical to the development of these technologies. It is ignorance, but the only way to fight ignorance is with facts and doing things like this.
Well, thank you so much for coming and spending so much time and educating us about rare elements and rare earth elements and critical minerals and how important they are to the United States, to Australia. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Cynthia.
Minister.
Thank you very much. Thank you.